actually it's such a privilege to be able to think of adapting to these new stages of life and how our bodies do change. And it's quite interesting, the focus around the menopause, because obviously when you say, you know, women or like people you age 35, 40, you immediately think, okay, we're kind of getting into the like perimenopause, menopause era of a lot of women's lives when they would begin to have some symptoms. And the metabolism is quite an interesting one, because I think a lot of people would say that one of the symptoms that they would feel is that they just can't lose weight as easily. They're sticking with this. They could be eating the same thing and they just cannot lose the weight. And of course there's lifestyle factors that do impact, but in terms of how our bodies break down the same foods that we've been eating maybe for the last 20 years, talk to me about that. How does the menopause actually impact that?
Well, so estrogen is obviously a major change. So estrogen levels really drop drastically at the menopause, and estrogen is involved in a lot. So we have estrogen receptors from like our scalp to our toe. That's why it's interesting working with women in menopause and doing the menopause research. You know, some of the symptoms are, you know, dry ears and things that you just think, oh gosh,
the glamour.
So there's all sorts. And I think it's important to, when talking about menopause, I think it's really important to note that every woman is very different. And you see this across how we experience our periods. You see this across how we experience our pregnancies, breastfeeding, postnatal periods. Like, these are all reflections of how different we are in how we respond to the hormones that we create and have. So that's important to note. So some women will be like, well, I'm actually fine. I had no issue maintaining my weight throughout menopause. And other women will think, actually, my weight started really changing in my late 20s. It really varies. But what we found in our study was that postmenopausal women, regardless of age, so this is a really critical piece. It's like, it's not age-related change. It's really to do with primarily this change in estrogen, circulating estrogen, dramatically impacts how we're able to deal with fats and sugars after a meal. So you see that like blood sugar stays elevated for longer, blood fat stay elevated for longer, and inflammatory proteins are higher in postmenopausal women compared to premenopausal women of the same age. And so, like, why and how? There's lots of mechanisms. So it includes like how efficient our liver and our pancreas are to reacting and releasing insulin, and then how sensitive we are to that insulin. So insulin sensitivity, which is really important for being able to take these nutrients up into your tissues from your blood. And it's sugar, it's fat, but it's also proteins. So like insulin is this really important key that opens mechanisms to transport these nutrients. That's impacted by menopausal status. So estrogen, again, playing a role there. And it's how the estrogen interacts with the receptors. It's so much going on. But also, the really exciting piece that we found was, again, this mediation from the gut microbiome. So we have gut microbes that are directly impacted by estrogen levels. And their role is to create an enzyme, or one of the roles, is not the only one, but this enzyme that essentially cleaves estrogen back off receptors and circulates it again, so that you can either reactivate it and it's used by tissues, or it gets excreted in your poo. That's where unwanted hormones go. And when you don't have these microbes, this system doesn't work so well anymore. And so some people call these groups of microbes the estrobolome, and they've been given this name because they're so sensitive to estrogen. And we think that we're actually doing some science on this now, but the changes in the microbiome composition around this time are also a really strong mediator for the women who see more sort of negative effects on their metabolism and how we react to food, and those that actually don't have as much of a negative experience with it. And so what's interesting there is, well, this change in the microbiome and its role could also help to explain in part why women who have a much higher intake of plants and fiber in their diet tend to have lesser menopause symptoms. So we think not only is fiber and plants really important for metabolic health because they help to regulate the absorption of things like sugars in the diet. They help to regulate appetite. They help with satiety signaling. But also, we think this influence on the gut microbiome is actually playing a role. So it's quite a complex picture. I can't pinpoint to one mechanism, but there are several mechanisms involved in how menopause influences our metabolic health.